God in prayer. Good afternoon, everyone. I sang that in honor of our friend James Noel. For the last couple nights off and on, I have to wrestle, go to sleep because he's with me and he's so heavy on my heart. So I just, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, God have mercy, Christ have mercy, God have mercy. And it's because my other brothers and sisters mentioned Jesus, I figured I need to sing a little bit about Jesus before I got started. And I almost wrote a poem for James. I think I'll do that, probably post it on Facebook, because his daughters have a Facebook page that they're maintaining his page. Because when I think of James, and I also often think of Dr. James and Dr. Dwight, because inevitably when I would be Scooby-Dooping coming out of the rooms in the evening just to check on them, they'd be sitting there sometimes pontificating, sometimes exegeting, sometimes philosophizing, just depended upon the time and what the particular topic was. And so I also want to honor Dwight for his friendship with James. Know that this is a difficult time for you also, so know that we're also praying for you because they're very close. Their families are close. Dr. James calls Dr. Dwight uncle, etc. And so one of the things that we do at Sankofa, and it's Sister Addie's and Dr. J. Alfred's genius of bringing the particular scholars together. Because let it be very clear, not all us's that look like us's with our experience of us's get along. I always say if you're over two, you have issues. It's just a matter of what are the issues, and if you recognize the issues, and if you worked on the issues so that you're not trapped by them, because we can get into a conundrum, and this is the beauty of womanist thought, those that really get womanist thought, womanist experience, it's about being for real, being your authentic self. So if Sister Addie can do something, I don't have to be jealous or envious. She's my sister, so I got a piece of that action. I don't need to go and talk about, child, y'all should have heard Sister Addie. She thinks she's so much. She's doing yada, yada, yada. But see what happens, and that goes back to what Dr. Reed was talking about, when it's embedded, what happens is that we take on some of the good, but a lot of the bad of the system that has oppressed us. Yeah. Because see, that's what we've learned. It's just like if all you ever had was cornflakes and milk for breakfast, whether you're at your Mima's house, your best friend's house, whatever, for 18, 20 years, and you come to college and I say, okay, let's go for a run, okay, let's go have lunch, breakfast, and then you don't see cornflakes. And so because you're polite, you say, well, I'm not hungry. I say, no, we just ran a few miles. You ate early last night, you need to eat. And if I can get you convinced enough to tell me the truth, then you'll tell me, well, but that's not breakfast. That's because, well, that's not my experience of what breakfast is. That's because I've not been exposed. That's one thing that Sankofa does. It's not that the information has not been out there. It's just we have not been exposed to it. And so as we think about womanist thought, when I think about Selma and Ferguson, of course, you got to think about Oregon. If Oregon had been occupied by First Nations and Native American persons, we would have had another Wounded Knee. If it had been occupied by black folks, and forget so-called immigrant Mexican folks, they'd have been so blown away, even if it meant them bombing it and poisoning the land. Because in some folks' minds, those bodies don't count. And so in many instances, what has changed, access on some levels has changed. The problem, however, with integration is that it's not been both ways. It's like, okay, when we integrated the schools, well, we'll bus some of you black kids and brown kids over to the other side of town, but we're not bringing any white kids over this side of town. We'll bring the best black teachers over to the other side of town, and we're going to give you first-year inexperienced white teachers who may really mean well, but they've not been exposed to the culture. It takes wisdom to become a teacher. Just having the education in and of itself won't necessarily help you to be able to deal with children that you've never experienced. And any child that's not respected, that doesn't get a meal, that doesn't have a strong family system, school is going to be difficult for them. And don't add in any type of learning disabilities. What has stayed the same? We're still, in many respects, some of us Christians are the biggest bigots and hypocrites going. Because we really, if we could tell the truth, we really don't want to do the Jesus thing. We want to do enough of the Jesus thing just so we can get by, so maybe we can get close to heaven. Love my enemies? Are you kidding me? Sometimes I don't even love myself. Don't love mama and daddy because they didn't do a good job. My sisters and brothers get on my last sanctified nerve. So how in the world am I going to love someone who I don't know when I can't stand the people around me? And so this is some of that embeddedness. We have learned to hate ourselves. So just as you were asked to not to turn on any devices, I want you to take some time over the next couple of weeks. Get yourself a journal, write it out by hand, and name 100 things you love about you, and then list the things you don't like about you. And list those things about, if I could just do this, then I'd be okay. For some of us, if I could just make more money, I'd be okay. For some people, if I was just taller, or if I weighed less, or if I was a lighter color complected, or if I had more friends, or if I was driving a Benz. We have all that stuff. But see, none of that makes us whole. See, because the only power in this life, or probably any other, that can make us whole is our relationship with God. Period. End of story. Don't believe me? Ask folks in 12-step programs. They will tell you, first step, my life, I became powerless within my life. I realized that other stuff I couldn't control. I can't even control my own stuff. How am I think I'm going to control other people? That's why language is so important. So please, those of you in your churches, please, pretty please, with 10 cherries on the top, stop using the language of man when you mean everybody. If you mean everybody, say people. Because when it said all men created equal, they meant all white male Protestant landowners. So white Catholic men who had property were not considered free. Any person of color not considered free. Any woman not considered free. They weren't talking about all of us's. And that's why we need to know the history, so we can know what did that document mean during that time. And what's fascinating me is many places in the world get it, but we in the church don't get it. For example, when the little trucks with the red sirens come and there's smoke in your house, who comes? Who comes? Fire who? Fire who? Firefighters, not firemen. Firefighters. When you put a stamp on an envelope, who comes to pick it up? Postal carriers or mail carriers. That's correct. If you're on an airplane and they want to know if you want peanuts, if you're lucky, or Coke, or if you got a credit card, if you want something a little bit stiffer, who asked that question? Flight attendants, right? They don't say stewards or stewardesses. Because you have as many men and women working those airlines. And if the cars, I guess some places are blue, some places it's still black and white. If they come with the sirens and want to have to pull you over because you were speeding, what do you call them? Police officers. So please, when you get back into your various groups and check your own stuff, watch how exclusive our language is. We're so close to saying, well, him, no, maybe it's a her. Well, doc, it doesn't make a difference. Yes, it does, because language has power. Because whenever I don't include you, I've erased your reality. And so if the sisters, many of them weren't bent over, they would get it. But sometimes you're going to have more fight with the sisters than you will with the men in the congregation. Why is that? Because many women have learned to play passive-aggressive in the areas of patriarchy and misogyny. We'll talk about that in a little bit in a minute. That's why culture is so important. Tamir Rice was mentioned earlier today. He's 12 years old, playing with a little toy gun. What in life would mean you had permission to shoot a 12-year-old? I don't care if he was 8 feet tall. He's still 12 years old. He's still playing in an area. Apparently, it's not that big of a park. But see, why did they do it? Because they could. It's always been happening. The Matthew Shepherds assassinated, murdered, been happening. Why do we know it? Because more people have cameras. It's not like this is new. It's getting exposed. And they tackled him, and they wouldn't even let his sister come and tend to her dying brother. And the first medical person the cops didn't check on him. It was the FBI agent who happened to be in the neighborhood checked on that child. And it just was released this week that the grand jury did not vote when they said that we're not going to indict the police. Grand juries are supposed to vote, and they didn't vote. So now the attorney and the family is trying again to get a federal indictment on the situation. But I'm just saying, these are the things that happen so we know that there's injustice. Other cases, we've been told that if only Eric Gardner hadn't resisted, he'd been okay. If only Michael Brown hadn't been a vicious thug. See, we use our language to dehumanize people. Well, he was just a thug. No, he was a child of God. He may have had some issues, but that didn't even make him any less human. If only Jonathan Crawford had dropped the toy arrow rifle, or Darian Hunter had been running away. Well, if I'm running away from you, I'm not a threat to you, so how's that a threat? Part of the problem, we were talking about this early in conversation, is that many of our police are retired military, and military taught to shoot to kill. In fact, even as I stand here in a place that has a lot of military, I think if you can have a boot camp to get somebody into the military, you ought to have a boot camp to help them get out, so that they can understand there's a difference and how you're going to deal with the issues of stress. Because in military, a lot of stuff, you don't have options. You are told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and you obey. I mean, my late husband was a retired military, so I honor all they do. I'm saying we don't do enough by them. And the whole police culture needs to change. Rather than shoot to kill, stop the suspect. And not by any means necessary. I mean, you could tase a person. You could shoot him in the knee. You don't have to kill him. What, 15 bullets? I mean, I think they were dead at bullet number 1 or 2. Anybody know who Julia Shields is? She's a Tennessee woman who's facing multiple choices. But they took her. She was shooting at police. She was waving her gun. Nobody shot her. She got arrested okay. And there was an out-and-out police chase. Now, if she'd been Hispanic or black, girlfriend, the car would have had 1,000 bullets in it. Forget her own body. But see that she was taken into custody without incident. Now, she wasn't in a park playing with a gun. She was driving around town brandishing a gun at police. And then we have the wildlife refuge, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. But it didn't end in a massacre. I think one person was shot. But again, if there had been Native Americans, there had been any Hispanic, Latinas, any black folks, they might even burn the place down. It's because which bodies matter. And if you don't know what Wounded Knee is, then that's an assignment. Go Google it and find out. So when we talk about womanist thought, it's about heightening our awarenesses. I mean, how do we listen? The fallacy of multitasking is if I'm multitasking, one task is not going to get the same treatment of the first one. And if I'm trying to do 3 things at a time, something really is going to fall through. What do we see? If I turned the video on right now on a parade and then turned it off after 10 minutes and say, what did you see? If you're into clothing and fashion, you'd probably be able to talk about the uniforms that people were wearing or the gowns that the people are and the suits that the people who are on the floats were wearing. If you're into automobiles and trucks and transportation, you probably would have been able to tell us how many flatbed trucks were used in the parade. If you're into music, you would have been able to talk about the type of music that was played, the genres, maybe how many marching bands there were. Again, now we're all watching the same thing, but what did we see? See, perception. That's why sometimes firsthand eyewitness testimony is not worth the papers on a lot of times, because what I see has a lot to do with who I am, where I've been, how I've been taught, how observant I am. And then we get to see who's in, who's out. And so when we look at womanist thought, it's about how do we engage our studies? How do we engage life? Because womanist thought is not only, it's about living and it's about analysis. Now, as mentioned earlier, it's true, black women have been doing, and folks who've been supportive, have been doing what we now call womanist thought for years. However, Alice Walker coined the term, and she got it from the term Womanist, who says basically, well, you trying to be grown too soon. Katie Cannon was one of the first people to use this because she recognized that if she looked at black theologians, for the most part, they were problematizing race. White theologians, feminist theologians, were generally problematizing gender. And that was because after Gloria Steinem, when she got ready to write her famous book, they were at a 20-year class reunion. They realized that after all they'd done and the degrees they'd gotten from, this was from college, that they still aren't really free. So they were looking at middle-class women's issues, not all women's issues. So Cannon said, well, what about poor black women? How do they fit in? And that's when she adapted the rubric of using womanism to do the work. And by the way, one of the reasons why, and this is not to put down anyone's political aspirations or political beliefs, but one of the reasons why a person such as Donald Trump can have the lead that he has is because what some political scientists has recently discovered. For the first time since they've been keeping data, people who are in the category of white middle class feel threatened. Because a lot of the jobs that were available, you know, you've worked 40 years, get your gold watch, you have your retirement party, that's not happening anymore. A lot of the jobs have either gone to China, to Thailand, to Mexico. So now you have a group of people hurting who've not been hurting before. How are their kids going to make better than they are when they're not making it? And this is a large group of people that are supporting the Donald Trumps. Why do we have Sankofa? Because if you don't learn anything else, you learn how to look at a body of evidence, how to engage it with an analytical, critical mind, and how to make a well-rounded decision. Another challenge I have for you, regardless of political persuasion, listen to some of the speeches and listen to what are they saying. Is it a series of sound bites? Does it even make sense? Is it realistic given the world that we live in? Because guess what? Of course, everybody who's running for whatever offices wants to be elected. So they're going to have their handlers and other folks back behind the scenes. Some even have major think tanks that while we sleeping, they're going to figure out, okay, what strategy, what buttons do we need to push to get the reaction that we want? But can it work? And remember, there are some tools that are oldest history, divide and conquer. So if you've been doing some community organizing, you better believe that the powers that be do not want poor black folks working with poor white folks, working with poor Asian folk. Because there's a lot of power when we work together. What will happen is they'll go visit the Asian folks and say, you know, we'd like to help you, but those Hispanics got to us first, and so the little money we did have, we already had to reappropriate for them. So, but I mean, we sorry, but you know, hey, y'all didn't get to us. The Hispanics got to us first. Then they'll go tell the Hispanics, well, now, you know what? We sure do love these hot tamales and that Mexican cooking, that refried beans, and, you know, we really like to support you, but them black folk been here a little bit longer than you are. You know, we only have a little bit of money, so we had to give it to the black folks. Yeah. Now, truth may be told that the black folks, nor the Asian folks, nor the Hispanic folks, nobody got anything. But because we don't talk to each other, and because we've been oppressed, and because we're looking to blame somebody else, how come y'all come up in here and getting our stuff, then we are subject to believing the lie. So then the black folks and the brown folks and the red folks will all be fighting over a postage stamp size of some resources. And the other folks just sitting back going, see, told y'all didn't need to be messing with them people. See, they just fighting amongst themselves. And meanwhile, when you look up, all the rules and laws have changed. Just real quick history lesson. Understand that where we are has been very systematically calculated. Understand that slavery was about economics, cheap labor. So when the Civil War is fought and when we have Reconstruction, that's not gonna fly with people. So we got to figure out another way to do this. Now remember, with Reconstruction, people were not allowed to read or write. So if I tell you you're free but you have no skills, you're not free. So what happens then? Sharecropping. So you're still in a form of slavery. And then, of course, the government stopped Reconstruction, moved the troops out of the South, and no one got that 40 acres and a mule. And so then move on down to where we got separate but equal, then that's overturned. And now we get the Voting Rights Act. Oh no, let me jump back before that. Dwight Eisenhower was in Germany and saw the Autobahn say, oh, we need this kind of highways in the United States. But what neighborhoods did all the highways go through, whether it's 35, 75, 85, 95, or 10, 20, 40, 80, went through black and brown neighborhoods. So now I'm cutting you off from your roots, because it's eminent domain. You don't have a choice, Dr. Bryant, whether you're going to sell me your property. You better hope I give you so many cents on the dollar. But you and your family got to move because we got eminent domain. And so we take up all this property that may have had a rich black heritage. Well, when you regroup, people don't then move back together. Everybody's going to try to find a place where they can live that they can afford, because you're not going to get the value that you put in. And so that was called urban renewal. The same thing happened with all those bridges that connect the various boroughs of New York. That's how hip-hop music got started. And rap music, which is part of hip-hop culture, because kids were protesting, why you take our neighborhoods, nobody talk to us. So, okay, we got urban renewal, but, oh, we got the Voting Rights Act. Oh, no, y'all think y'all got the Voting Rights Act. So what are we going to do? It's called gentrification and redistricting. And then, oh, 3 strikes and you're out. And, oh, we're going to create a drug war when there was no drug problem. I'm sorry, how in the world do poor people ship in drugs or fly in drugs? I would be so intrigued and never be able to find this out, but I'd like to know where the money really goes. Like how many senators or politicians or CEOs, CFOs really got all the drug money. And so see that happen, and then we've talked about mass incarceration. So you can look at every 10 to 20 years, there have been some political strategy that makes sure a certain group of people will never get ahead. So Womanist Religious Studies is interdisciplinary. We ask questions. We're black liberationists, take serious any concept where one can be oppressed, whether it's race or gender or age, ability, sexual orientation, ecology, all of those. And so womanist scholars are looking at those. And by the way, not all womanist scholars are Christian, and we are not all womanist scholars are from the United States. I met some womanist scholars who were from Amsterdam. And I know Dr. Towns has done a lot of work with womanist scholars in Brazil. So we have pockets of womanist scholars throughout the world. We take justice seriously, and we need to look both on the global, the domestic, the local, and the personal level to stop acts of injustice or violence. It's rich and expansive. This was the brochure that's at the bottom. It was a 2012 celebration of womanist legacy in New York City. It was awesome and amazing. We also understand that it is organic, and it's about humor. It's about self-knowledge, about having intergenerational conversations. It's about loving all people, as Dr. Hopkins mentioned earlier, loving people sexually and non-sexually. We have so many hang-ups around sex in and out of the church. It's not pitiful. It's not to be laughed at, but it is. Of course, part of that, we can thank one of our church fathers, Augustine, for that. I mean, we bought into a lot of his neuroses. What are you talking about, Kirk-Duggan? Go read his Confessions, and then read some of the other works by Augustine. Augustine had a troubled mind. And see what happens, but when we hold up a person's thought, we have to realize, how did they get to think that? And all the business about original sin, the fall. Nobody fell out of anything. They were put out of the garden. You know, and folks talk about, well, the Bible says, well, but we say the Bible says a whole lot that sometimes the Bible does not say. When we're doing womanist thought, we want to look at the aesthetic or the beautiful, the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, look at all of it toward being able to be whole, to have passion, to be complete, to work in community, to analyze, to honor the lives and the gifts of folks who are forgotten, the silenced and the vulnerable. We also want to heighten people's awareness. Who are you? And many times somebody says, well, who are you? And we start talking about where we work or the degrees we have. That's not who I am. Those are functions and roles that I do. And so that's my third question for you. Who are you? And can you even answer that? Not who your parents said you should be or who society says you ought to be, but who are you? It's about liberation. It's about honoring that imago Dei, the image of God. If we could even start to imagine, to think about being able to perceive, Sister Addie, each other as having the image of God, and then that would revolutionize everything we do. I mean, but that makes a huge assumption that we understand who God is. And so some of us don't, so that could be a problem. But it's important to start there. We ask all kinds of questions about the quality of life and about being good stewards of your resources. Like, do you get enough sleep? Are you overspending? See, we shouldn't be living within our means. We should be living under our means. So if I'm giving 10 cents to the church, then 20 cents automatically ought to be saving that. Therefore, I ought to be able to live on 70 cents. How many of us? So that's my fourth question. Are you living above your means? If so, I'd rather tell people to stop it, but you really need, I want to invite you to stop living above your means because you're creating more stress. And the more stress you create for yourself, you end up having a toxic body and a body full of inflammation. A body full of inflammation gets sick faster, and so you're going to die prematurely just because you're stressing yourself out. Womanist theology and thought includes but not limited to issues of theology where we ask questions about identity, sacrality, subjectivity, spirituality, and empower. We look at the Bible and other sacred texts and ask questions of authority. Who are the characters? What about the language and rituals and history? We explore ethics. What do we value? How do people behave? Who's visible? Who has integrity? And how's the praxis set up? How interesting it is so many times in the Bible a woman never gets to speak for herself. The narrator speaks for her, but many times she doesn't speak for herself. And when she does speak for herself, it's quite fascinating. That's why, as he was preaching, Dr. Jowell was preaching last night, I was a good little Christian girl because I didn't stand and say, "Excuse me, Doc." Abraham, Isaac, and Abraham, who did I leave out? Jacob and Isaac, they weren't by themselves. We gotta look at Sarah and Hagar, and we got to look at Rebecca and Leah and Rachel and all those women. And if you go to Exodus, if it hadn't been for the women, Moses would have been dead, D-A-I-D. Because it was, I mean, you know, I will never forget Bishop Vashti. The first time I heard Bishop Vashti McKenzie preach, she preached that text and said, who but a God would allow a woman to get paid for something she would have done anyway? Because remember, Miriam went and asked, well, do y'all need like a wet nurse? I think I know somebody who might be a wet nurse for the baby. And so the mother got hired for being the wet nurse for her own son. And I'm Shipper and Poor, some clever sisters. Well, we don't know about, I guess it was in, Scarlet Hair. I don't know about birthing none of them babies. Well, Shipper and Poor said, well, hey, them Hebrew women, they kind of strong. Them babies are out before, hey, we don't know what to do. It's called strategizing, a little bit of tricks to figure up in there. And about context, looking at authority, culture, aesthetics, ecology, and community, we better start acting like what we do to the earth matters. All this funny weather and people having tornadoes. Well, I grew up in Louisiana. Hurricanes, yes. From June to September, that was a potential. Didn't know anything about no tornadoes. Not in South Louisiana, North maybe, but not South. And now they having tornadoes. Let's keep being foolish about that. We need to know about how do we know. That's what epistemology means. How do we teach and how do we live? And so for many womanists, it's a way of life and it's a discipline. And so we need to know the language of oppression. That's my second challenge to you. How to use language. And how many times does nasty, ugly remarks come out of your mouth when you're supposed to be doing ministry or just having a simple conversation? So please, for example, say, you just like you. You've already condemned somebody. Or that's a stupid thing to say. Why would you judge somebody like that? If that's their experience, that's their experience. Why would I think it's stupid? And I may think it's stupid because I don't understand and I'm trying to front. We need to be aware of racism and sexism and classism and ageism and homophobia and ableism. And you can learn so many things when you read emails on Facebook, because I was reading one Facebook account and I actually researched it, and some of the folks at home would be astounded to know that King James who paid 47 folks to translate the Bible, because folks act like if it's not King James, it's not a good text. King James was gay. Don't believe me? Look it up. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is not Kirk-Duggan making stuff up. And if you Google it, I forgot the website, but it will it even detail with he had sexual relationships with some of his cousins and other male friends as a young man. I'm just telling the truth. And we have to be careful about what barriers exist and about that embeddedness again and how we buy into stuff. It's like, well, them Koreans always come in our neighborhoods and put a store. Well, we better buy from them because there's no other place for us to go. Otherwise, we got a desert. But my question is, why are we hurting on the Koreans or the Hindus, whoever come in? Did you pull your pennies together and open a store? Well, if we didn't, we have no right to complain about anyone else. What we need to learn how to do is how to form coalitions. You know, I was talking with someone the other day who was saying one of the reasons why some people don't attend church and don't engage is because they find more love on the street. Somebody about to take a last toot on that last bit of reefer about almost to burn their fingers, but they're going to share it with you. But up in the church, here come Dr. Hayes. Every time she comes, she talking about this and that. On that little scooter. I guess she's going to start doing wheelies after a while. Why is she here? Instead of saying, awesome, she's here. She cares enough about us to be here. What can I learn from her? But see, that passage, Luke 13, bent over. For a long time, I thought the person had actually bent over, but it's spiritual bent over. But you know what? If you're physically bent over, you can't see what's in front of you. All you can see is your toes. And many of us do toe theology. We're looking at our toes and trying to command respect from everybody else, talking about what they ought to be doing, what they did, them people. You know, some of us would be better off if we just practice zipology and not say anything. And that's my next challenge. The next time you have a conversation with someone, because you know what? Some of us, before the person is finished, we're already pulling together our answer. If I'm already thinking about the answer, then I haven't been listening. So I'm more concerned about my response than I am with your thinking. So next time somebody speaks to you, just listen, might learn something. And then, unfortunately, there are a lot of biblical texts that people use to support bad behavior. Of course, some of the biblical text is pretty rough. I mean, like you check out Deuteronomy between 21 and 28, and it says very clearly, if the son misbehaves, his mother and father, and I was intrigued, it actually mentioned mother and father, take him to the elders of the church to stone him. I said it was a good thing that, you know, some of us Christians haven't followed that because we would be a non-existing race of people. Because everybody's gotten in trouble at some point in time. And that in the Hebrew Bible, women are the property of their fathers or their husbands. So those of you who marry, I encourage you, don't say who gives this woman. She's no property to be given away. Change that and say, who stands with this couple and will pray with them and walk with them? Because that's more about community rather than about somebody trying to run somebody's lives. I'm so glad they took about love and obey. Obey who? Supposed to obey God. We're to look at language of oppression, and some of us don't realize how filled, especially the English language, is with violence. You listen to some of them nursery rhymes, Jack and Jill fell down the hill, you know, that kind of thing, or Jack Spratt could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean. I mean, some of the stuff. And the 3 little pigs, the 3 bears, there's a lot of violence in that stuff, and we read those nursery stories, and kids hear them. They're all up in there. Oppression is systemic, and it's often couched in polite language, but it's ingrained by supremacist patriarchy. And one of the differences today than before is it's so subtle, but it still happens. For example, I may not outright fire you, but I'll just give you so much work until you're going to have to quit. Oppression represents an infringement on human rights and the rights of creation. It's dehumanizing. And so we're about exposing all of this in biblical texts. Because, see, some of us practice bibliolatry. We worship the Bible. We don't really worship God. We say the word, the word, the word, the word. That's why I like Karl Barth's definition of the word. It's scripture. It's also the Jesus the Christ. And it's proclamation. And this is my own stuff, and I admit it right here, but you know, some of us is so Johannine, it makes me want to scream, either too Johannine or too Pauline. But when we study John, you have to remember, why did he spend those first 18 verses in that prologue? It's because he was dealing with folks who thought that you got salvation by knowing the right knowledge. And so we try to superimpose stuff out of the New Testament back in the Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew Bible stands on its own. Yeah, when it says, let us make humanity, that's the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. No, it's not. Because that plural is the Babylonian plural for God. Because Babylonians, guess what, had many gods. That's why it's important for us to study our languages. Oppression is heinous. And then I think about it because I'm getting ready to I'm working on a commentary on Hosea with Dr. Valerie Bridgman. And a lot of years people have done allegorical readings of Hosea, especially 1 through 3. I mean, can you imagine the names of those children? Not my people, not going to pity you. And Hosea is told by the deity to go find a woman who's a whore and marry her. And then in chapter 3 it's even like Gomer is actually a slave. But see, we spiritualize that stuff. You say, oh yeah, that's just about God and Israel. It may be about God and Israel, but if you are calling people out and you can treat Gomer like that and Hosea can treat her like that, then in one respect, it gives us permission to treat every person who's involved in sexual trafficking or prostitution as if they're a non-entity. We have a lot to learn. Violence continues to grow, and we're all subject to it. We've all experienced it, so we really need to be careful about it. And violence often blurs the lines of reality and get into ambiguity. Here's some of our oppressions. Racism, violence of bigotry, sexism, gendered violence, homophobia, gendered violence, again, a different type, classism, violence of access, ableism, violence of capacity, ugliness, the metaphor of oppression. And so as you do womanist thought, I hope as you do whatever type of analysis you do, what is a language? How has patriarchy influenced your life? I am forever grateful for my parents, because I didn't realize that I should have possibly thought that I was less than some man until I got to seminary and women wanted to form a women's group. I went, well, why would we need to form a women's group? I'm accustomed to hanging out with the fellas. And that's when I heard all the stories of the oppression. I wasn't the son my dad wanted, or I was abused, or I was looked over. And even today, in many institutions, you take male, female, say they've both been teaching 15 years, they're associate professors, equal publications, equal experience, and he's going to be making more money than she does. Now, what kind of justice is that? Some of that same stuff is happening in some of your churches, so don't act like y'all not guilty of doing some of that. Now, when women finally get it, that's why I tell my Catholic friends and my Southern Baptist friends, if they realized all they would have to do is stop tithing and not show up for 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, all of a sudden, God gave us a new revelation. I mean, but that's why we have to have conversations. I'll never forget, I had a student, I'll call him John. John had been preaching for 40 years and doing ministry. And he called me up one day. He took the class with me. It's required at Shaw. It was called Women in Western Religious History, and now it's called Gender, Women, and Culture. We expanded the course. He said, Doc, I said, yeah, how you doing? He said, I've been in ministry for 40 years, and it's only been since I've been taking your class, we might have been a third way in, that I realized that women ought to be able to preach and women ought to be able to pastor. But in the context that he grew up in, it didn't happen. I mean, you do know that was a Pope Joan, right? Okay, I'm going. When you get a chance, read Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, because it's going to show you the power of what oppression can do. Because when she looks at this family, it's called the breed-love family, she realizes that the ugliness was not about their physical characteristics. The ugliness is what they believed about themselves. Some of us internalize that ugliness. So from the wounds of oppression sown in slavery, pampered by Jim Crow, Japanese internment camps, the slaughter of native peoples, and abusive use of many recent immigrants to do menial labor for pocket change, and titillated by internalizing the violence of separate and unequal and venting the anger on others, the poisons of pain, self-hatred, self-defeatism, insatiable desire, and rage ooze throughout this country and the world like the afterbirth of Mount Vesuvius throughout society. That's what happens with our violence, with our practices of oppression. And so I also commend another book to you by Bell Hooks, Killing Rage, because she tells us about how insidious oppression is. And the very last one, she says, the fury and anger that bubbles up amid an experience of violation is painful. Without an outlet, that rage can evolve into intense grief and destruction. That's why we have so many young men in prison. That's why we have a lot of young men and young women in gangs, because they know the gang will be a family. Once they are jumped in, they got support. It doesn't matter if they have to kill somebody to get in. But that somebody cares. Too many of us church folk don't care. Not really. How many Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts groups do we have? How many mentoring programs do we have? How many of us visit our seniors? How many of us have a Saints Club where seniors are on it and seniors have mentors, younger women and men who look after them, who remember their birthdays, especially for people who live alone? There's a lot of sources there that I used for this event. For me, one of the critical texts, and I'm going to borrow from Drs. Reed and Hopkins about the Luke and Matthean text next time I make a presentation. For me, it's Luke 10, 25 through 27. In one instance, it's, what must I do to be saved? They ask Jesus. Another, what is the most important of the Hebrew laws? And another one is, what must I do for eternal life? In every instance, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul, or some iteration of that. Love your neighbor as yourself. So, we welcome you to Sankofa. It's an invitation to dance. It's an invitation to think. It's an invitation to become your own authentic self. Now, what I must say, just freedom is expensive. And once you experience this transformation, you will not be the same. So if you have a propensity or need to stay sick or in a land of bliss, then don't come to Sankofa. Howsoever, as they say in the in the hood, if you really are ready to go there, if you really want to figure out who you are authentically, if you want your walk with God just to be more intense, more intimate, then come to Sankofa. Thank you.